In this video, you're finally going to use the ES6 import and export statements to break up your application code into multiple files. So instead of having one big file that contains everything your application needs to run, we're going to be able to have multiple smaller files that can communicate with one another. And that's going to allow us to make web apps that actually scale. As we add more components and as we introduce more libraries, there's no way we're going to be able to fit everything in one file and still stay sane. Now, there are really two parts to using ES6 import and export with Webpack. Part 1 is the ability to load in files you wrote, and Part 2 is the ability to load in third-party modules, things like React and React DOM. In this video, we're going to focus on how we can create other files inside of our source folder, and we're going to look at how we can import them and how those files can export various values. We're not going to need index.html or package.json for this one, so let's go ahead and close both of those down. Now, the ability to use ES6 import and export, it's set up by default by Webpack. There is no need to do anything more. The basic Webpack config includes the module bundler that allows us to break up our apps into multiple files. We already know that the entry point is indeed the file that gets loaded and executed by default. We can see that right here. app.js is running, starts, and we haven't made any special changes to that file. It just has a console.log. But what if we had another file in our program? Let's go ahead and add one right here. I'm going to add a new file, utils.js. And utils.js is going to contain some utility functions. Let's say we have some functions that we want to define here, and we want app.js to be able to use them. So for now, let's just use console.log. Utils.js is running. So we're just going to keep track of exactly when the code in this file runs. Now, if I were to save the utils.js file, you're going to notice that the browser doesn't even refresh. This file isn't getting picked up at all. And why not? It's not getting picked up for two reasons. One, it is not the entry point for our Webpack application. Two, it is not being imported from that entry point or any file this entry point imports. So what does that mean? It means it might as well not exist. The fact that we added this file to the source folder basically means nothing. What we need to do is actually bring it into our application by either setting it up in Webpack config, which we don't want to do, or importing it in app.js, which we do want to do. So right here, we're going to go ahead and get that done by taking our very first look at the import statement. To kick things off, we'll use the import keyword. Then inside of quotes, we provide the relative path to the file we want to import. That is the relative path from this file to this one. We start off with ./. This brings us to the current files directory, which is source. And from source, where does the utils file live? Well, it lives right inside of there. So we can just use utils.js. Excellent. Now, if we go ahead and save this, we can see how that affects the output of our application. Previously, the utils file never ran. If we rerun the application, we can see this time around, we are getting utils.js is running, and down below, we're getting app.js is running. So the first thing app.js does is it runs utils.js. That is why the utils log prints first. Then after that runs, down below, app.js prints its own message. And the end result is these two logs printing to the screen. So there we have it. We've just imported our very first file inside of Webpack. Now, if we head over to the terminal, we can take a quick peek at how this affected the output. Previously, below the one static asset, we had a single file that was being used to generate that asset. It was the source app.js file. This time around, you're going to notice not only was that file used, but Webpack is now also showing us that it loaded in the utils file. So this is giving you a complete rundown on all of the files that ended up getting included based off of the various imports inside of your application. Now let's switch back to the browser and back to Visual Studio Code, and we're going to try to come up with a more meaningful import statement. Currently, we're just running that file, and this isn't particularly useful. What I want to do is get some value out of utils. So maybe there's a function over there, for example, that I want to take advantage of in this file. Let's go ahead and create a function in the utils file. I am going to toss a semicolon on here, something I should have done earlier. Now, this function could be something really simple. We're not going to worry about the complexity of the function. Right now, we're just interested in figuring out how we can define it here and use it over here. To do that, I'm going to make a const. We'll make a function that squares a number. So it'll take a single number in, x, and this will be an arrow function that returns x times x using the shorthand syntax. Now I can go ahead and save this file, and over inside of app.js, I can try to take advantage of it. Right here, console.log. We are going to print the return result of calling that brand new square function, passing in whatever value we like. I'm going to pass in 4, in which case I would expect to get 16 back. Now, if I save app.js, you're going to notice that over in the browser, we're actually getting an error. First up, we get our utils message. So we know that function was defined. Then we get our app.js message. And lastly, we get an uncaught reference error. Square is not defined. So this brings us to the first really important thing to note about all of the files inside of your Webpack application. Each one of them maintains their own local scope, which means that variables defined in app.js aren't automatically accessible by every other file, and the same is true with utils.js. Just because we define this variable and loaded that file in doesn't mean we have access to everything inside of it. If it did work, if this worked, that would mean that Webpack was polluting the global namespace, and if we added more and more files, there would be a chance for some sort of naming conflict, in which case our application would crash. That's just as much of a mess as if we had 15 script tags using the global namespace. So we're going to go ahead and avoid this, and to avoid it, we have to figure out how we're going to actually get values out of utils.js. And to do that, we need to look at the export statement. So import is only half the battle. This is going to let us grab some values from a given file, but that file has to choose to export some values as well. Right here, there are two types of exports. First up, every file could have a single default export, and you could have as many named exports as you like. So we have access to these two types of exports. We're going to go ahead and start by exploring named exports. Right here, we're going to do that by using the export statement. Now the export statement gets called with a set of curly braces right here. This is where we can define our named exports. And it's important to note that this is not an object definition. So I cannot, for example, set a value like name equal to the string Andrew. This is going to fail. These curly braces, once again, not an object. Down below, Webpack is throwing an error because we're misusing the export syntax. What we put inside of here is references to various things we want to export. So for example, we already have a square variable defined. We can choose to export that by typing it right here, square. Now this is the valid way to use the export syntax. If we go ahead and save utils.js, our app is going to refresh once again, and we're back to the original error where square is not defined. So we've exported it from here. The last thing to do to get our code to work is pull it off inside of our import statement. So even though we've set up the export, we're still not going to have access to square. We have to actually switch up this import statement. I'm going to go ahead and just comment that one out, and we'll write a new one from scratch. So let's go ahead and start with the import keyword. We're going to use import. This time, instead of going on to the file we're trying to import, we're going to talk about the things we want to import off of that file. In this case, we want to grab a named export. So we're going to set up curly braces once again. And remember, this is also not an object. This is just the import syntax. Right here, inside of curly braces, we can specify any of the named exports we provided over here. In this case, square. It's important that the names match up, so square. Then, after the curly braces, before the file path, we use from. Now we can provide the path. So right here, ./utils.js, exactly what we had before. So all we've done is we've taken this statement and we've added this stuff right inside. When you are trying to grab an export, you provide the exports you want, you use the from keyword, and then you provide the file path. Now, if we go ahead and save app.js, for the very first time, our application is actually going to work. And what do we get? We get 16 printing over in the console, which is fantastic. It's fantastic because 16 comes as the return result from square, a function whose definition lives in the utils file. Now that we've created one function and exported it, let's go ahead and do that again. This time around, we're going to make a const called add, and we can set up add to take two numbers, a and b, and we're going to have add return a plus b. So we can implicitly return a plus b. Now we have this new add function and we want to export it in order to take advantage of it in other files. So what do? We have to provide it right here inside of those curly braces. Now when you're setting up multiple named exports, what do? we provide a comma between the lists. So it would be square, comma, space, add. Now utils has two named exports, square and add. We can access as many of them as we like from any file that imports this one. I'm going to save utils.js, and now we could tweak app.js right here. If I wanted to grab add alongside of square, comma, space, add, and there we go. We now have access to that function. We can go ahead and use it down below, console.log add. I'm going to go ahead and add 100 to 23. The end result should be 123. And if I save app.js, you can see that is exactly what I get. Now, just because a given file exports two things doesn't mean you have to grab two things. It is perfectly valid to only grab the things you're actually using. So if I only need add from utils, I can just import add. There is no need to import square just because it's defined. Now, obviously, if you're going to use it, you want to import it. But if I were to comment this out, everything would work as expected. We are just grabbing the add function. We are just using the add function, and the application runs without generating any errors at all. I'm going to undo those changes, bringing back the square input and the square function call. Now, these are called named exports because we export them by name, and when we import them, we have to use the exact same name. So the order doesn't matter. Here we happen to use square and add, and you might think the order does matter, but let's go ahead and try to rename square to square with two E's. If I try to do that, over inside of the browser, you're going to see that Webpack is throwing an error. It is alerting us that the thing we are trying to use is not defined, and this is correct. When we try to import off of utils, it is looking for a named export called square with two E's that does not exist, and the end result is our program crashing. So the order is not important. The name is what's important. Let's go ahead and revert those changes, bringing us back to a working application where we have 16 and 123 printing. Now, when it comes to exporting our named exports, there is one alternative way we can get this done. If we don't want to do it all in one shot down below, we can actually export the individual variables as we define them. To do that, we just toss the export keyword in front of the const square and in front of the const add. This has the exact same effect as what we saw down below. We still have a utils.js file, and it still has two named exports, the names coming from the variable names. And as we can see, the application still works as expected. Now, there is no way to export without that variable declaration. For example, if I was trying to export a string like test, this is not going to work. If we were to save the file, Webpack would crash. So if we are trying to set up named exports, we either want to do it down here using curly braces to export as many things as we like, variables that already exist, or we can use export in line. We can use it right before the variable declaration. Both have the exact same effect. Now that you know the very basics of ES6 import-export, it is your turn to do this again as a challenge. Over here in app.js, I am going to comment out all of the code we have so far, leaving it in place as a reference, and your job is going to be to create a new person.js file, which is going to live right alongside of these two. Now, person.js is going to export two functions, just like utils did, two named exports. So we'll set up a named export. The first one will be called isAdult. This is going to take an age in, like 18, and it is going to return true if that age qualifies you as an adult in your country, and false otherwise. True if adult, otherwise false. Now, obviously, what qualifies as an adult in your country might change, so if it's not 18, you can go ahead and change the logic for that. The second named export you're going to set up will be called can drink. This function is also going to take an age, and unfortunately in the United States, just because you're an adult doesn't mean you can drink. The age here is 21, so you're going to do true if 21 and over, otherwise false. Now, once again, I know that most countries have a lower drinking age, so feel free to customize that to fit the needs of your country. The goal here is to not create the most foolproof logic. The goal is to get these two exports set up and to actually import them here. Import isAdult and can drink. Then down below, you're going to use both printing results to the console. So you want to use both of these, pass in some values, make sure the correct thing shows up in the console. Take as much time as you need to get this one done. It's going to require you to do a few things that you just learned how to do. So there is no rush. Take it nice and slow, knock this out, test your work, and when you're done, you can go ahead and click play. All right, how'd that one go? Let's go ahead and kick things off. The very first step is an easy one. We're just going to be creating that new file, person.js right here. And inside of here, we know we want two named exports, is adult and can drink. So I'm going to set up both of those. Const is adult and const can drink. Now for is adult, this is going to be a function that takes in an age, and we're going to return true if they are 18 and older, false otherwise. So if the age is greater than or equal to 18, that'll result in true. Otherwise, false will be the return value. For can drink, we're going to add the same logic with a different value. So right here, we're still going to get the age. Then we're just going to take the age and check if it is greater than or equal to 21. And maybe you customize these to fit the needs of your country. That's perfectly fine. Now at this point, we have the two functions, but there are no exports set up. If we want to set up named exports, we have to use the export keyword followed by curly braces. And in here, we provide all of our exports. So for example, is adult and can drink. Now we can actually import this file and take advantage of these two functions. I'm going to do that over inside of app.js. I'm going to go ahead and remove all of the comments for this challenge. And right here, I'm going to use import. I'm going to import two named exports. Those need to go in curly braces. We have to match the names up exactly. Is adult, can drink. Excellent. Now we're trying to grab these from a specific file. Inside of quotes, we have to provide the relative path to that file. // gets us into the source folder. And from here, the file is person.js. Now that we've loaded both of them in, the last thing to do is call them. I'm going to add a couple console.log calls right here. First up to is adult, I'll pass in 17. You are not an adult. That should return false. And right here, I'm going to use the other export, console.log can drink. I'm going to use can drink, calling it with a number. I'll pass in 21, and that should return true, since if you're 21, you can drink. Here we go. We got false and true, which means everything is working correctly. If I were to switch these up to 18, which is an adult, and 20, someone who can't drink, we would get true and then false. So there we have it. Hopefully you were able to get that done without too much trouble. Let's take just a quick moment to recap. In this video, we learned that all of our files live in isolation, which means that just because we create a variable in that file doesn't mean other files are going to have access to it. If we do want to give access to another file, we have to use export and specify the things we want to export. If I were to leave can drink off right here, app.js would not be able to take advantage of that function. Now, the same thing is true when importing. Just because you've exported something doesn't mean you have access to it. We saw that when we loaded in utils. What we need to do is set up the import to actually grab those named exports by their name. Now we know there are two types of exports, named exports and default exports. We've only explored named exports so far. In the next one, you're going to take a look at default exports. I'm real excited to get to that, so stay tuned. I'll see you then.